The air was heavy that evening in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The country, still scarred by years of political instability, stood at a crossroads. President Ibrahim Traoré, a young but resolute leader, paced in his office. Outside, the city was alive with murmurs of dissent, whispers of coups, and the ever-looming shadow of foreign influence. Traoré had been thrust into power only recently, his name now synonymous with change, resistance, and the promise of a new era. He had become the face of Burkina Faso's defiance against the West's control over African resources and politics. His rise had been quick, but it was not without its risks. Every move he made seemed to stir a pot that had long been boiling over. As he sat down at his desk, the weight of the decisions before him seemed even heavier. His advisors had been briefing him on the growing tensions with the West, America, France, and the European Union, each country watching closely as his government steered the nation away from Western influence. Just as he was about to pick up the phone, the door to his office opened and a courier entered. In his hands was a sealed envelope, the red wax stamp unmistakable. Kim Jong Un's emblem glinted under the office lights. "Mr. President," the courier said, bowing respectfully. "A letter from the supreme leader of North Korea." Traoré's pulse quickened. He had heard rumors, of course, whispers of secret deals, of potential allies waiting in the shadows. But he had never expected this. A letter from Kim Jong Un, the leader of one of the most secretive and isolated nations in the world. He took the envelope from the courier, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The room seemed to grow colder as he opened it. The paper inside was thick, the ink dark and precise. As Traoré read, his eyes narrowed, and a sense of disbelief began to settle in his chest. The letter was an offer, an alliance, of sorts. The paper crackled softly as Ibrahim Traoré unfolded the letter. He had expected the message to be cryptic, perhaps vague. But the words on the page were sharp, direct, and unwavering. To His Excellency Ibrahim Traoré, President of the Republic of Burkina Faso, I extend to you my deepest respect for your unwavering strength and commitment to the sovereignty of your nation. We, the people of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, have been closely following your rise to power and your bold stand against the Western imperialist forces that seek to dictate the future of African nations. It is time for a new order, one where countries like yours, rich in resources and potential, no longer bow to the whims of foreign powers. The West has long sought to keep Africa in a state of subjugation, but we know that a new vision is emerging. You are that vision. In light of our shared goals for independence, we wish to offer an alliance. We propose a partnership that will give you access to our advanced technology, military support, and economic backing. In return, we ask that Burkina Faso stand with us on the international stage, creating a bloc of sovereign nations that will be able to push back against Western domination. We are prepared to help you secure your nation's future, by any means necessary. The West will not be able to stand against us. Together. We await your response, President Traoré. Know that the fate of many lies in your hands. With utmost respect, Kim Jong Un, Supreme Leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, **. The weight of the letter settled on Ibrahim's shoulders like a boulder, threatening to crush him under its significance. The words in front of him weren't just a diplomatic gesture, they were a challenge. An offer of power, yes, but one that came at a cost. This was not just about trade agreements or military support, it was about ideology, about aligning with a regime whose methods of control were as absolute as they were brutal. And yet, the temptation was undeniable. His country, ravaged by decades of mismanagement and exploitation, needed allies, strong ones. Western powers had never treated Burkina Faso as anything more than a pawn, an economic footnote in their colonial legacy. This offer from North Korea, strange and terrifying as it was, presented an opportunity for true sovereignty. But what would it cost him? What would it cost his people? Traoré stood up abruptly, his mind spinning with the implications. He had been brought up to believe in the African Union's ideals, in the power of Pan-African solidarity, but could he afford to ignore this foreign power that had offered its hand? Was this the only chance for Burkina Faso to rise from the ashes? Or was it the first step in shackling the country to a new, dangerous master? His mind raced as the weight of this choice pressed down on him. The letter was not just an invitation, it was a call to war. A call to reshape the global order. The silence in the room was deafening. The letter, still open on his desk, seemed to burn with an urgency. The moment had arrived. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking his reverie. It was a message from his trusted advisor, Tiamoko, a veteran of many political battles. President, you must respond carefully. We know the West is already watching. This letter may change everything. Traoré clenched his fists. The stakes had never been higher. And yet, somewhere deep inside, the prospect of a new order, a new way forward called to him. He turned the letter over, looking at Kim Jong Un's signature. It felt almost like a declaration of war. But this time he was no longer afraid. No longer unsure. His fingers hovered over the phone, ready to begin crafting a response. The world was watching, and the fate of his people rested in his hands. He could feel the weight of history in this single moment. The room felt colder now, despite the warmth of the midday sun spilling through the wide windows. Ibrahim Traoré stood still, his fingers still hovering over his phone. The message from his advisor, Tiamoko, weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just a matter of diplomacy anymore. It was about survival, of his presidency, of his country. He walked slowly to the large map on the wall, tracing the path of Burkina Faso, wedged between its powerful neighbors. In the past, his nation had been a battlefield of influence, torn between former colonial powers and the emerging superpowers of the East. But this offer from North Korea changed everything. It wasn't just an alliance, it was a test, one that could either elevate him to the status of a true leader or condemn him to the history books as a puppet to a foreign power. His heart pounded as he thought of the consequences. The West, led by the United States and its European allies, would not take kindly to such a shift in alliances. The political pressure from those powers could be crushing. But the promise of military support, of technology that could strengthen his nation, was intoxicating. It could provide the leverage needed to push back against the foreign corporations and military forces that had long exploited Africa's resources. As he stared at the map, he thought of the images he had seen from the recent uprisings. People across Africa rising up against the same powers that had long oppressed them. Was this his moment to be part of that revolution? Or was this simply another trap, one that would leave his people shackled once again? His mind raced through the possibilities. North Korea's offer, while a potential boon for his military, was not without its dangers. He had read the reports, heard the rumors about the oppressive regime's tactics. Would he be able to maintain his independence if he accepted this deal? Or would he become a pawn in a larger geopolitical game, as so many African leaders before him had? The soft buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts again. This time it was a message from a Western diplomat, a delicate note from the United States Embassy. The message was succinct, but it carried weight. President Traoré, we have been informed of the recent correspondence between your office and North Korea. This is a critical juncture for your leadership. We urge you to consider the long-term consequences of aligning with a regime that has been labeled as one of the most repressive in the world. The United States remains committed to supporting your sovereignty, but such an alliance could isolate you from much-needed international support. We trust you will make a wise decision. The message was loaded with veiled threats, wrapped in the promise of continued support. Traoré could almost hear the pressure in their words. The West had always held Africa in a chokehold of dependency. Was this a reminder of that power? Or an attempt to manipulate him into choosing the side of their empire? He sighed and leaned against the table, his thoughts whirling. Tiamoko had been right. Every move he made now would be watched, dissected. If he accepted Kim Jong Un's offer, the West would undoubtedly sanction him, perhaps even back a coup within his government. If he rejected it, he risked leaving his country vulnerable to continued exploitation by the West and its allies. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Tiamoko. Ibrahim, Tiamoko's voice came through, low and measured. We need to talk. I know you're still thinking about the letter. But I can't stress this enough. We need a plan. We don't just face the West's pressure. There are factions within your government that are already discussing their own moves. If they see weakness now, they'll strike. They know what this letter means for your future. I know, Traoré responded, his voice tight. But what other choice do I have, Tiamoko? If I say no to Kim Jong Un, then what? I have to keep my people safe. They need more than just words. They need action. Then we must be careful, Tiamoko advised. This could be a power grab from Kim, or it could be a genuine offer. But we can't just leap into this without understanding the risks. The internal factions are watching you. You have to show them you're in control, no matter what decision you make. Traoré exhaled deeply. It wasn't just the West he had to worry about. His own government was beginning to fracture. The idea of a coup was not a mere fantasy. His country's leadership was fragile, and every powerful move he made risked stirring the pot further. A North Korean alliance would send shockwaves through his cabinet, with some ministers already sympathetic to Western powers, while others could see this as an opportunity to rebel. If we move forward with this, Traoré said, his voice firm, we need to make it look like we have the situation under control. We cannot afford any signs of weakness. You have my word, Tiamoko assured him. I'll begin preparing the security forces. If this is a game, we'll make sure we're the ones playing it. Traoré paused, the weight of his decision still pressing down on him. The letter from Kim Jong Un was not just an invitation, it was a gauntlet thrown at his feet. To accept would mean standing with a regime known for its authoritarian rule, but it would also mean defying the West and stepping into a new phase of Africa's struggle for independence. To refuse would be to face the wrath of both North Korea and the rising tides of internal rebellion within his own country. He gritted his teeth, his decision now clear in his mind. The world would watch, but it would no longer dictate his moves. Burkina Faso's fate was no longer in the hands of foreign powers. It was in his own. Later that night, Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk, drafting his response to Kim Jong Un. To His Excellency Kim Jong Un, I have read your letter with great interest and respect for your bold vision for the future. I believe we share many common goals, particularly in our mutual desire for sovereignty and independence from foreign influence. However, the path to true freedom is not without its challenges, and I am committed to ensuring that Burkina Faso's strength and dignity are never compromised. We are prepared to discuss the terms of a partnership that will ensure the safety and prosperity of my people. But I must make it clear that any alliance we form will be based on mutual respect and understanding, not submission. We will meet on our terms, and the future will be ours to shape together. Respectfully, Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. With the letter written, Traoré leaned back in his chair, his mind still buzzing with the enormity of the decision he had just made. Tomorrow the world would know his answer. And from that moment on, everything would change. The next morning, as the sun rose over Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré woke with the sense that his world had irrevocably shifted. The words he had written the night before were no longer just ink on paper. They were a declaration, a challenge to the established world order. He had taken a stand. Now the repercussions would come swiftly. His phone buzzed as he dressed, the text from Tiamoko waiting for him. The letter is out. The West already knows. We'll need to be on high alert. The internal factions will start moving soon. Traoré sighed and tucked the phone into his jacket. The decision to send the response was made. There was no turning back now. He had chosen to side with his people, his sovereignty, and his own sense of dignity. But that came at a cost. The weight of the world rested on his shoulders now. Within hours of sending the letter, the world began to react. News outlets across Europe, the United States, and Africa were abuzz with the stunning development. Headlines screamed, Burkina Faso's president shocks the world, aligns with North Korea. The response from the U.S. Embassy came quickly as expected. A terse statement echoed through Washington's corridors, urging Traoré to reconsider. The U.S. has long been a partner of Burkina Faso. This decision jeopardizes that relationship. Traoré sat at his desk, watching the reports unfold on the television. He could feel the weight of the international gaze on him, scrutinizing every word, every movement. He knew this wouldn't be a simple diplomatic incident. This was the beginning of a larger confrontation, a political chess game with global stakes. But he wasn't about to bend under pressure. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his military advisor, Colonel Yakuba. A tall man with sharp eyes, Colonel Yakuba had served under Traoré's command since his rise in the military, and the bond of loyalty between them was unshakable. Mr. President, Yakuba began, his tone formal but strained. We've been receiving intelligence reports from multiple sources. There are already whispers of a coup. Some factions in the military are aligning with Western interests. If we don't act swiftly, we could lose control of the situation. Traoré nodded, his face stern. He had expected this. Prepare the security forces. Ensure our allies are positioned. We can't afford to show any weakness. Yakuba's eyes narrowed. Understood. But sir, we need to be careful. There's talk of more than just military action. If this leads to a widespread rebellion, we could find ourselves fighting a war on two fronts. Let them talk, Traoré said, his voice low. The people of Burkina Faso are watching. We will not be intimidated. We will show them strength. Later that day, the internal political landscape began to shift. Ministers who had once stood by Traoré now began to question his decision. A private meeting with the cabinet was called, and the room was filled with murmurs of discontent. Some ministers voiced their concerns about the potential consequences of an alliance with North Korea, citing the risk of alienating international partners and plunging the country into further instability. Sitting at the head of the table, Traoré remained calm. His piercing gaze swept over the group, taking in their nervous faces. He had anticipated this reaction. The old guard, those who had benefited from Burkina Faso's ties to the West, were starting to see their power slip away. "Gentlemen," Traoré said, his voice firm and commanding, "this is not about what's easy. It's about what's right for the future of our country. For too long, we've allowed ourselves to be pawns in the global game. Now we have a chance to shape our own destiny." One of the senior ministers, a middle-aged man named Mark, leaned forward. "But President Traoré, the risks are too great. We can't afford to cut ourselves off from the West. They have the power to cripple us, economically, militarily. We need to rethink this." A silence fell over the room as everyone waited for Traoré's response. His face remained unreadable. "I understand your concerns," he replied. "But I am not afraid of the consequences. Burkina Faso will no longer bow to external pressures. This is our moment to rise." Mark shook his head, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "You don't understand, sir. This could be the end of your presidency. You are gambling with our future." Traoré's eyes hardened. "I am not gambling. I am securing our future. You may not see it now, but this is what must be done." In the following days, Traoré's government found itself besieged on all sides. The U.S. and its European allies ramped up their diplomatic pressure, sending envoys to Ouagadougou with demands for an immediate reversal of the decision. But Traoré stood firm, his resolve growing stronger by the day. Behind the scenes, however, the military factions that had been quietly aligning with Western powers began to move. There were reports of covert meetings, whispers of a coup being planned under the guise of a restoration of stability. Some ministers loyal to the West began to disappear, their whereabouts unknown. Traoré knew that the only way to survive this was to outmaneuver his enemies, both foreign and domestic. His country was on the brink of a full-scale political and military conflict, and he was determined to hold on to power at all costs. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, a sudden knock at the door broke his concentration. It was Tiamoko. "The situation is escalating faster than we anticipated," Tiamoko said, his voice tense. "There's word of a military uprising. It's happening, Ibrahim. They're trying to take control of key areas." Traoré stood up, his gaze unwavering. "We won't let them. We fight and we show them that Burkina Faso is not for sale." Tiamoko looked at him, then nodded. "I'll coordinate the defense. But this won't be easy. We'll need all our allies and we need them fast." Traoré clenched his fists. He had no illusions about what was to come. This was no longer a political struggle. It was a fight for survival. As the political and military tensions began to boil over, an unseen hand watched quietly from the shadows. North Korea's offer had shaken the global balance of power, but it was not the only force at play. Other powers too had a stake in what happened next, and they would soon make their move. At the heart of the crisis, Traoré stood unbowed, determined to protect the future of his people. But even he knew that no decision came without a price, and the price of defying the West was about to become clear. The stage was set. Traoré had made his choice. But would it be enough to protect Burkina Faso's sovereignty? Or would the weight of international power topple him? As the crisis deepened, the political storm that had gathered around President Ibrahim Traoré's decision to align with North Korea raged on. The tension was palpable in the streets of Ouagadougou, where protests against his government's stance began to erupt. From within the government to the farthest corners of the country, both support and opposition took shape. The world had placed its bets, and now the very essence of Burkina Faso's future hung in the balance. In the weeks that followed, the divisions in Burkina Faso's leadership grew more pronounced. The cabinet had fractured. Ministers loyal to the West clashed with those who supported Traoré's defiance. Within the military ranks, high-ranking officers began to openly question their loyalty, while lower-ranking soldiers struggled to align themselves with one side or the other. Traoré, in his wisdom, knew that the key to maintaining control lay in the hearts and minds of the people. The majority of Burkina Faso's citizens had long felt abandoned by the West, victims of colonial history and ongoing economic exploitation. For many, his alliance with North Korea was a symbol of defiance, of standing tall against those who had long held power over their destiny. But this message, while empowering to some, had also created fear. What would the West do? Would they come for Burkina Faso's resources? Would they topple the regime through economic sanctions, covert action, or even military intervention? The questions lingered, and the answers, as always, lay hidden in the corridors of power. The real threat to Traoré's presidency, however, was not just the external pressures from the West, it was the coup that was slowly being organized within his own military ranks. The whispers of rebellion had transformed into more than just idle chatter. The pro-Western factions within the army began to take action, attempting to rally the soldiers who had lost faith in Traoré's leadership. Traoré had been expecting this. He knew the price of defying the international order. But now, as his military intelligence officers reported back to him with details of the plot, he realized just how close the coup was to becoming a reality. It wasn't a matter of if it would happen, it was a matter of when. The report from Lieutenant Colonel Alida Zongo was clear. Key military units were on the verge of defecting. Zongo, once a staunch ally of Traoré, now found himself torn between loyalty to his commander and the ever-present pressure of his Western backers. "Mr. President, they've already begun moving. The general has pledged his allegiance to the West," Zongo said, his voice grim. "We must act now before it's too late." Traoré's fingers drummed on the desk in front of him. He remained calm, his mind calculating the steps ahead. "Is it just the general?" "No," Zongo replied. "It's more than just him. They've made alliances within our military. We can't trust anyone, not even in the capital." Traoré paused for a long moment. "Then we go to the people," he said quietly, a fire burning in his eyes. "We'll show them what true leadership looks like. We'll stand firm and we'll make it clear that anyone who turns against us is turning against Burkina Faso." It was time for Traoré to move beyond the confines of government buildings and military bunkers. He had to address the people directly. The streets of Ouagadougou had been filled with unrest, but they had also been filled with hope. Hope that their president might be the leader to defy the powers that had long oppressed them. That night, under the cover of darkness, Traoré prepared a speech that would galvanize his supporters. As the broadcast began, the glow of the television screens illuminated the faces of citizens who had waited anxiously for his words. "My fellow Burkinabe," Traoré's voice rang out, steady and unyielding. "We have been told by the West what our future should be, but we will decide our own fate. We will not bow to foreign pressure. We will not be ruled by fear." His speech was a call to arms, both figuratively and literally. It was a plea for unity, a rallying cry to the people to reject the forces seeking to destabilize the country. He reminded them of their strength, their history, and their heritage. "We are not slaves to anyone," Traoré continued. "We have stood on our own 2 feet for centuries. We will not be intimidated by those who seek to control us." The following days saw the country on edge. Pro-government militias began to take to the streets, rallying behind Traoré's message. But so too did the opposition forces, those who sought to restore Burkina Faso's old ties with the West. The country was now divided not just along political lines but along a more dangerous axis: loyalty. By the end of the week, the coup began in earnest. At dawn, the loyalist forces clashed with those who had defected. Gunfire echoed through the streets of Ouagadougou, and the capital descended into chaos. In the midst of the firefight, President Traoré made his move. He had been watching the developments closely and now he was ready. He would not wait for the inevitable. He would act swiftly and decisively. With the help of loyal officers, Traoré launched a series of countermeasures. Strategic strikes against key military posts loyal to the coup plotters were executed with precision. In one swift movement, Traoré wrested control of the military strongholds, securing the loyalty of crucial forces. But the conflict wasn't over. The battle lines were drawn. As the dust settled in Ouagadougou, Traoré knew he had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The West had made its intentions clear, and while Burkina Faso had staved off immediate collapse, there were whispers that other powers had moved in to support the coup. The shifting alliances on the global stage were more complex than he could have anticipated. Traoré could feel the hand of North Korea on his shoulder, but the specter of Western intervention loomed large. What had started as a letter, a simple communication, had now escalated into a global struggle for power. In the coming days, Traoré would have to navigate this treacherous new world, where alliances could turn to dust in an instant, and his own life, and the life of his country, hung by the thinnest of threads. The world was watching closely as the crisis in Burkina Faso escalated. The whispers of North Korean influence over President Ibrahim Traoré were becoming louder. In the West, there was growing concern, even fear, that Burkina Faso could become the latest front in a geopolitical struggle, a proxy battle between the West and North Korea. With the military coup attempt now crushed, but the nation still teetering on the brink of civil war, Traoré found himself at the center of a storm with far-reaching implications. At the United Nations, debates raged about how to handle the situation. The United States, backed by European powers, sought to isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically. The rhetoric became harsher by the day. Traoré is a puppet, they said, a pawn in North Korea's dangerous game. Sanctions were discussed and the threat of intervention loomed. Meanwhile, Kim Jong Un's silence was deafening. He had pledged his support for Traoré, but it was clear that the North Korean leader had his own designs on the relationship. The alliance, though forged in a moment of desperation, was not as straightforward as it seemed. Both men had ambitions, but those ambitions didn't always align. As Traoré walked through the halls of his presidential palace, his mind was heavy. The air in Burkina Faso had shifted from a sense of unity to one of uncertainty. People had rallied behind him in the streets, but the international community was hostile, and his military was divided. Traoré needed to act decisively, but each step forward felt like a leap into the unknown. One evening, as the sun set over the vast savannas, Traoré sat alone in his office. The letter from Kim Jong Un was still on his desk. He had read it over and over again, each time feeling the weight of its words more deeply. In it, Kim Jong Un had praised him for standing up to the West, for resisting the pressure to conform. But hidden between the lines was something more. A subtle suggestion that North Korea had its own plans for Burkina Faso, a vision that was not entirely in line with Traoré's hopes for the country. Kim's words were clear: "We are allies in defiance of the West, but our vision must go beyond mere resistance. We must create a new order, one that aligns with the strength and self-sufficiency of our nations. A future where we control our resources and our destinies, not at the whims of foreign powers." It was tempting, so very tempting. But Traoré knew that this was not just a simple alliance. It was a challenge to the very foundation of his leadership. Would he fall under North Korea's influence? Or would he maintain Burkina Faso's sovereignty, even if it meant standing alone against the world? Days turned into weeks, and the political maneuvering in Burkina Faso became even more intense. Traoré's own government was under siege. The pro-Western factions, although defeated in the coup attempt, had not disappeared. They were regrouping, preparing for the next stage of their resistance. They had not only allies within the military but also among influential businessmen and diplomats in the capital. The whispers of a second coup were already circulating. Traoré knew that his presidency was in jeopardy. The alliance with North Korea, while providing some measure of support, also alienated key factions within his own government. His ministers were divided, unsure of what path to take. Some, like Prime Minister Salimata Diakite, were steadfast in their loyalty to Traoré, while others, like the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Amadou Bamba, began to quietly distance themselves, fearing the global consequences of aligning too closely with Pyongyang. The fear of military intervention from the West was real. Diplomatic talks had stalled and economic sanctions had begun to bite. Traoré's government was struggling to maintain basic operations. Trade had slowed and foreign investment was drying up. Burkina Faso's economy, once buoyed by optimism, now seemed to be crumbling under the weight of international isolation. But as the days dragged on, Traoré remained resolute. He was not a man easily swayed by threats or pressure. He had already faced the wrath of colonial powers and had learned long ago that the path to true independence was never without sacrifice. The world had always seen Burkina Faso as a pawn on the chessboard of global politics. Now, under his leadership, it would no longer be anyone's pawn. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Traoré received a visitor at the palace. General Oumar Sankara, the leader of the Burkinabe military, had requested a private meeting. Sankara, a seasoned soldier and one of Traoré's oldest allies, had been with him from the beginning, but even his loyalty was being tested by the increasing pressures both from within the military and from outside forces. Sankara entered the room with a solemn expression, his face drawn tight with concern. "Mr. President," he began, his voice heavy, "I must speak frankly. The military is fractured. The coup attempt may have failed, but the danger is far from over." Traoré listened intently, his eyes never leaving Sankara's face. "What are you suggesting, General?" "There are factions within the ranks, officers who are still loyal to the West who are planning to make another move against you. And there are others, more moderate voices, who are growing wary of your alliance with North Korea. There are also those who believe we must negotiate or we risk everything." Traoré leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "And what do you believe, General?" Sankara hesitated, a look of uncertainty crossing his features. "I believe we must take control of the narrative. The West is playing a dangerous game. But North Korea's influence could also be a double-edged sword. We need to tread carefully. There are too many players in this game and we cannot afford to lose. Traoré sat silently, pondering Sankara's words. The pressure was mounting and the stakes had never been higher. Would he continue to stand firm against the West, or would he bend to the will of North Korea, whose long-term interests might be far more complex than they appeared? Traoré had spent sleepless nights wrestling with these questions. The weight of leadership, of responsibility, pressed down on him with every passing day. He had always believed that the people of Burkina Faso deserved more than to be pawns in a geopolitical game. He believed in their strength, in their potential. But now, more than ever, he realized that the decisions he made would determine the fate of his nation. And so, he prepared for his final decision, a decision that would alter the course of history. As the weeks went by, the tension in the air grew thicker. Every decision Ibrahim Traoré made seemed to have reverberating consequences not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire region. The stakes were higher than ever, and he could feel the weight of the world pressing against his shoulders. In the palace, he sat surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The once strong unity among his inner circle was beginning to fracture. Minister Diakite, the staunch ally who had supported him through the coup and beyond, was becoming increasingly anxious. Her tone was sharper with each passing day, and the underlying unease in her voice was becoming harder to ignore. Each passing day, and the underlying unease in her voice was becoming harder to ignore. "Mr. President," she said one morning, pacing before him, "we are caught in a web. North Korea may have provided us with a temporary shield, but we must not forget the long-term consequences of our actions. The West will not simply stand by as we shift alliances so drastically." Traoré nodded solemnly, his eyes scanning the room. His ministers, all men and women of experience, were watching him closely, waiting for the direction he would set. "What are you proposing, Salimata?" he asked, his voice steady but with a touch of weariness. "That we abandon the North Koreans and turn back to the West? You know as well as I do that they've already shown their true colors: interference, manipulation, and outright hostility." Diakite stopped pacing and turned to face him, her gaze intense. "No, Ibrahim. I'm not suggesting we abandon North Korea. But we must have a plan, a way to ensure that we do not lose ourselves in this political chess game. We must ensure that Burkina Faso's independence remains intact. We cannot be puppets to anyone." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew the risks that came with continued allegiance to North Korea, but the truth was even more unsettling. The risks of severing ties were equally dangerous. It was a delicate balance, one that could tip either way at any moment. Traoré knew that the greatest threat was not coming from outside. It was coming from within his own ranks. The coup attempt had shown him that the country's military was divided. While some remained fiercely loyal to him, others were increasingly disillusioned with his leadership. Their fear of North Korean influence and the growing instability caused by international sanctions had created a volatile mix. The whispers of a second coup attempt were not merely rumors. They were a reality. Traoré had received intelligence from several high-ranking officers that a faction within the military was planning to move against him once more. They were building support, aligning themselves with pro-Western factions, and making their moves in secrecy. One such officer, Colonel Adama Ouedraogo, had been a trusted ally in the past. However, his recent actions suggested he might be drifting toward betrayal. Traoré had heard reports that Ouedraogo had been meeting secretly with diplomats from the United States and European Union, trying to secure support for a coup. The realization sent a chill down his spine. The man who had once been his confidant was now potentially his greatest threat. Late one night, after an emergency cabinet meeting, Traoré found himself in the palace's private chambers, alone with his thoughts. The gravity of the situation was overwhelming. His options were limited, and the future of his nation hung in the balance. His gaze turned once again to the letter from Kim Jong Un. The words that had seemed so promising at first now felt like chains. North Korea had offered its support, but at what cost? Traoré had been so eager to reject the West's influence, but he was beginning to question whether he had underestimated the price of such an alliance. But then, in that quiet moment, an idea began to form in his mind. It was a risky plan, perhaps the most dangerous of his life, but it might be his only way out. If he could secure his position within the military, neutralize the coup attempts and reassert control over his government, he might be able to recalibrate the alliance with North Korea without losing his sovereignty. It would require a masterstroke of strategy and diplomacy, but it was his only hope of surviving this crisis. He immediately summoned his most trusted military leaders, the ones who had stood by him from the very beginning: General Sankara, his loyal advisor, and Colonel Cabaret, who had once been his mentor. It was time to put his plan into motion. But even as he prepared to execute it, he knew that this gamble might cost him everything. The following day, Traoré met with Kim Jong Un's ambassadors in secret, deep in the bowels of the presidential palace. The air was tense, thick with the unspoken understanding that the future of their relationship, and of Burkina Faso, depended on these next few moments. Ibrahim Traoré, the North Korean envoy said, his eyes cold and calculating. "We are pleased to see your resolve, but there are conditions. We need more than just words of defiance. We need action. North Korea has resources to offer, but you must prove your loyalty. There can be no half measures." Traoré leaned forward, his mind working rapidly. The North Koreans were no longer simply allies. They were partners in a high-stakes game that could determine the future of his country. "I understand," Traoré replied, his voice low but firm. "I will not be a puppet. But you must understand our interests are aligned in some ways but not entirely. I will not surrender Burkina Faso to anyone. This is my land and I will fight for it." The North Korean envoy nodded, an almost imperceptible smile crossing his face. "Then we are in agreement. The next move is yours, President Traoré." As the meeting concluded, Traoré felt the weight of his decision. He was now entangled in a dangerous web, one where every move would have repercussions far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The next few days would determine whether he could hold on to power, whether he could reshape the fate of his nation, and whether he could survive the storm that was quickly brewing. The final test came when Traoré received a new piece of intelligence. The coup, which he had feared was only a rumor, was set to unfold sooner than anyone had expected. Colonel Ouedraogo had made his move, aligning with a faction of military officers who were prepared to strike against Traoré's government. The time for hesitation was over. Traoré could no longer be passive. The conflict that he had sought to avoid had come to his doorstep. But he was not going down without a fight. As dawn broke over the horizon, he gave the order. The military would move swiftly, decisively, to neutralize the traitors within their ranks and preserve the integrity of his government. This would not be a simple battle. This would be the moment that determined everything. Would he emerge victorious, or would this be the last chapter in his tumultuous reign? The fate of Burkina Faso, and his own, now rested in his hands. The air was thick with anticipation. Traoré's military had mobilized swiftly, but he knew that the situation was delicate. Colonel Ouedraogo and his faction had already gained significant ground, rallying enough support within the ranks to mount a challenge. The coup was not merely a matter of military might, it was a fight for the soul of the country. In the heart of the capital, Ouedraogo's loyalists made their move. Early in the morning, gunfire rang out across the streets. Soldiers loyal to Ouedraogo stormed key government buildings, while others clashed with Traoré's forces. The tension was palpable, the echoes of violence reverberating through the streets of Ouagadougou. But Traoré was not unprepared. The plan he had set into motion was already taking effect. The loyalists under his command, led by General Sankara and Colonel Cabaret, swiftly counterattacked. Traoré had ensured that the most strategic positions in the city were well guarded by his most trusted officers. The battle for Burkina Faso's future had begun. As the fighting intensified, Ibrahim Traoré found himself in the palace's war room, a place where decisions were made in hushed tones and under immense pressure. His advisors were on edge, eyes flicking to the maps spread across the table, which detailed the positions of both loyalist and rebel forces. His thoughts were a whirlwind, racing faster than the events unfolding outside. "How long until we have full control of the situation?" Traoré asked General Sankara, his voice calm despite the chaos. "We've retaken the presidential palace and cleared most of the western districts," General Sankara replied, his brow furrowed with determination. "But Ouedraogo still holds the northern sector. He has some support in the military and civilian sectors. It's going to take time to flush him out." Traoré nodded, his fingers tapping the table, a sign of his deep concentration. He knew the longer the conflict dragged on, the more casualties would mount. The people of Burkina Faso were suffering, and the world was watching closely. Every move he made would have global repercussions, especially now that his alliance with North Korea was on the brink. "What of the North Koreans?" Traoré asked, shifting the conversation. He had to ensure that his powerful new allies understood the stakes of this internal struggle. "They've been waiting for your signal," the envoy had informed him days ago, but now Traoré was unsure how much more they would tolerate. Would they remain true to their word if Burkina Faso's future was uncertain? As the fighting raged on, Traoré was presented with an ultimatum, one that would determine his future and the future of his country. The North Koreans had sent another letter, this time not just from Kim Jong Un but also from a high-ranking military official who was eager to see the full extent of Burkina Faso's commitment. The letter was blunt. President Traoré, the time for action has come. We will not stand idly by while you lose control of your nation. If you wish to remain in power, you must act decisively. Your loyalty is now a matter of global importance. Reading those words, Traoré felt a surge of frustration. His sovereignty, his independence, was being traded for promises of support that were not guaranteed. The North Koreans had offered him power and protection, but they had made it clear that if he faltered, they would not hesitate to abandon him. Traoré's grip tightened on the letter. This was not merely a political battle, it was a battle for his very identity. He was not about to let foreign powers dictate the future of Burkina Faso. But to reject them now would be to face an even more dangerous future. One where both his enemies at home and abroad could unite against him. It was time for a bold move, one that could either ensure his rule or lead to his downfall. The decision was made. Traoré would take the fight directly to Colonel Ouedraogo. There would be no more waiting. The coup needed to be crushed before it could gain any more momentum. Traoré's military had the advantage in strategic positions, but Ouedraogo had the support of key military leaders and, most importantly, the loyalty of a portion of the population that was disillusioned with Traoré's increasingly authoritarian rule. I want a full-scale counteroffensive, Traoré ordered, his voice hardening with resolve. We will march on the northern sector and crush any resistance. There will be no second chances. General Sankara's eyes locked with Traoré's, understanding the magnitude of the moment. It will be done, Mr. President. But even as Traoré gave the orders, he knew that this battle was far from over. Ouedraogo would not go down easily. The country would be torn apart in the process, and it would take years to rebuild what had been lost. Yet, in this moment, Ibrahim Traoré was willing to risk everything. The battle for the northern sector was fierce. The streets of Ouagadougou became a battleground as Traoré's forces pushed forward with relentless determination. The air was thick with gunfire, the sound of explosions reverberating off the walls of the city. Tanks rumbled down the main streets, and the sky above was filled with the smoke of conflict. Colonel Ouedraogo had prepared his forces well. His soldiers fought with desperation, knowing that if they lost this fight, their future was over. But Traoré's forces were unwavering, driven by a single goal: total victory. As the final push came, Traoré's forces breached the last line of defense. It was in the northern outskirts of the city that the two leaders met face to face. Colonel Ouedraogo stood at the head of his remaining loyalists, his eyes filled with defiance. He had lost much of his support, but his spirit was unbroken. "You are making a grave mistake, Ibrahim," Ouedraogo said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can defeat me? This country will never be yours to control." Traoré stepped forward, his presence commanding. "You do not understand, Colonel. This is not just a fight for power. It's a fight for the soul of Burkina Faso. I will not let it fall into the hands of traitors." With that, the final clash erupted. The two forces collided, the fate of the country hanging in the balance. The battle was brutal and both sides suffered heavy losses. But as the day wore on, it became clear that Traoré's forces were beginning to gain the upper hand. Colonel Ouedraogo, realizing his position was untenable, made a desperate move. He ordered his remaining forces to retreat, hoping to regroup and find another day to fight. Traoré's forces did not give chase. Instead, they solidified their positions, ensuring that any further rebellions would be swiftly crushed. The battle was over. Traoré had won, but the victory felt hollow. The cost had been high, and the wounds of this conflict would linger for years to come. In the aftermath of the battle, Ibrahim Traoré returned to the palace, weary but resolute. His government had survived the coup, but the challenges were far from over. His alliance with North Korea was now a fragile thread, and the international community was watching closely, unsure of what the next move would be. Traoré knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the cost of power would continue to demand a heavy price. But one thing was certain: the world had seen his resolve. He had chosen to fight for Burkina Faso, and no foreign power, no internal threat could take that from him. Would this decision prove to be the foundation of his enduring rule, or would it be the beginning of his downfall? Only time would tell. The dust had barely settled after the victory, and the atmosphere around Ibrahim Traoré was far from celebratory. The internal strife had cost many lives and the government was fractured. Though Traoré had quelled the coup and secured his position, it was clear that Burkina Faso was on the brink of something far more dangerous. As Traoré sat in his office, His fingers idly traced the edges of a map of West Africa, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He could feel the eyes of the world watching, particularly from the West. The United States, in particular, had made no secret of its disapproval of his recent actions. The letter from North Korea now seemed even more loaded with significance. The tension between the shifting allegiances was becoming more palpable by the day. Traoré had maintained contact with the North Korean leadership, but the letter he had received now was far more than a simple diplomatic gesture. Kim Jong Un's words were filled with both promises of support and veiled threats. If Traoré wanted the North Korean alliance to remain strong, he would have to make bold moves, both on the international stage and within his own borders. But it wasn't just North Korea that Traoré had to worry about. Western nations, particularly the United States and France, were stepping up their diplomatic efforts, applying pressure on Burkina Faso to abandon any ties with North Korea and reaffirm its commitment to Western-backed alliances. These countries had been wary of Traoré's rise to power, viewing him as a wild card in the already unstable region. But the pressure was far from over. In addition to his dealings with global powers, Traoré had to contend with the internal political dynamics. Colonel Ouedraogo's failed coup might have been crushed, but the underlying divisions remained. The faction that Ouedraogo had commanded was far from finished. They were regrouping in the mountains, seeking support from neighboring countries, hoping for a chance to reclaim power. As Traoré's government tried to stabilize, reports of growing unrest in the northern and eastern regions of Burkina Faso began to surface. In these rural areas, the population was increasingly divided, and local militias began to form. There were whispers that Colonel Ouedraogo was not only gaining strength in the military but also among the influential tribal leaders who controlled the vast agricultural regions of the country. They saw Traoré's rule as a departure from the traditional ways, and many feared that his leadership could lead to more instability. Traoré knew he needed to act quickly, but he was caught in a bind. On the one hand, he had to suppress the growing rebellion from within, but on the other hand, the pressure from foreign powers to toe the line with Western-backed agreements was mounting. He had to ensure his survival on both fronts, internally and externally. As he paced back and forth in his office, contemplating his next move, his advisor, Colonel Cabaret, entered the room with troubling news. "Mr. President," Cabaret said, his voice strained, "we've received word from the UN that Western nations are preparing to impose sanctions on us if we continue our alignment with North Korea. The United States has already called for our suspension from international trade agreements. They're pushing hard for us to distance ourselves from Kim Jong Un." Traoré felt a surge of frustration. His dreams of a new independent path for Burkina Faso were being suffocated by the same global powers who had long sought to control the region. But he had made his choices. He had decided to follow a path that would bring Burkina Faso more autonomy, even if it meant standing up to the West. "I've heard enough," Traoré muttered, his gaze fixed on the letter from Kim Jong Un. "We will not bow to their threats. We stand by our alliance with North Korea. They are the ones who are offering us true support. If the West wants to push us into a corner, so be it." Cabaret looked uneasy but nodded. "Understood, Mr. President. But we must be prepared for the consequences. They will not take this lightly." Traoré nodded, his mind already working on his next steps. It was clear that the war for Burkina Faso's future was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The coming days were marked by intense diplomatic activity. Burkina Faso's foreign ministers were dispatched to neighboring countries to build support and reinforce alliances with other African nations. Traoré was determined to strengthen ties with any nation that was willing to offer support, whether economically or militarily. However, it was clear that most of these alliances were temporary, based on self-interest rather than genuine solidarity. Back in Ouagadougou, tensions were growing in the streets. Protests broke out as people grew increasingly disillusioned with the ongoing violence and instability. A portion of the population had hoped for a more democratic government, and the coup had only deepened their frustrations. They saw the military's grip on power as an obstacle to progress. For Traoré, it was a balancing act, attempting to quell the unrest while negotiating with foreign powers and dealing with the persistent threat of another rebellion. He was not just fighting for his own survival anymore, he was fighting for the survival of his country. In the meantime, Colonel Ouedraogo's forces, though still in disarray, began to reassemble in the northern highlands, with support from local leaders. It was only a matter of time before they would make another attempt to overthrow Traoré's government. The whispers of discontent had grown louder, and the north was becoming a volatile region that could tip the scales of power in the country. The military intelligence reports from the northern provinces were alarming. Ouedraogo's forces had become more organized, and they were receiving supplies from unknown sources. Traoré suspected foreign interference, but the details remained murky. Could this be a larger international effort to undermine his regime? Traoré couldn't ignore the possibility that both internal enemies and external threats were conspiring against him. By now, Ibrahim Traoré had seen enough of the chaos and the threats. The time for decisive action had come. His government was in peril, and the only way forward was to strengthen his alliances while simultaneously quelling the internal unrest. Traoré stood before his trusted officers, General Sankara and Colonel Cabaret, his expression hardening. "We will not let this country fall into chaos," he declared, his voice unwavering. "The West wants to see us kneel before them. North Korea stands with us, and that is enough. We will push forward, we will hold our ground, and we will secure the future of Burkina Faso." The room fell silent. His officers knew the weight of his words. This was no longer just a political struggle, it was a fight for the very soul of the nation. Traoré's eyes darkened as he looked at the map once more. His next move would determine not just his fate, but the future of Burkina Faso. The room fell silent. His officers knew the weight of his words. This was no longer just a political struggle, it was a fight for the very soul of the nation. Traoré's eyes darkened as he looked at the map once more. His next move would determine not just his fate, but the future of Burkina Faso. Would he choose to rely on his new alliance with North Korea, or would he have to confront the West head-on, knowing the price of defiance? As President Ibrahim Traoré stood on the balcony of his presidential palace, overlooking the city of Ouagadougou, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The letter from Kim Jong Un still burned in his hands, the words on the page reverberating in his mind. It wasn't just a diplomatic proposal, it was a challenge. A test of loyalty, a test of his country's strength and resolve. "Mr. President, it's time," his advisor, Omer, said, stepping up beside him. Traoré glanced at him, a fleeting moment of uncertainty crossing his face before he wiped it away. "Yes, Omer, it is. But I need to think this through." The political landscape of Burkina Faso had shifted overnight. What had once seemed like a straightforward governance battle, with the West pressuring him to open up his country's resources and align more closely with their interests, was now entangled in a dangerous game with two of the most unpredictable regimes in the world. "Traoré, we can't afford to be passive," Omer added. "The West will try to break us with their sanctions, but we have an opportunity here. North Korea is a rogue state, yes, but they know how to push the world's buttons. If we side with them—" "I know what the offer entails, Omer," Traoré cut him off, his voice cold. "But what about the people of Burkina Faso? What about our sovereignty? I won't sell my country's soul just for power or protection." Omer nodded, understanding the gravity of his president's words. "We know what's at stake, but the balance is tipping, Ibrahim. The West is breathing down our necks, and the internal threat of a coup is becoming more real by the day. You've seen the whispers. You know the factions trying to break you." Traoré turned away from the balcony, the weight of his advisor's words sinking in. He had long known that power wasn't just about making decisions in the best interest of your people. It was about survival. Survival in the face of betrayal, in the face of an increasingly unstable geopolitical environment. "I'll meet with them," Traoré said finally. "But not just for the sake of protection. If North Korea wants to talk, it will be on our terms. I will not be manipulated by anyone." The meeting with the North Korean envoy was scheduled within the week. Behind closed doors, the reality of the situation was stark. Kim Jong Un was offering not only military support but also economic aid, technology, and a stronger foothold in Africa. But there was a catch, as there always was with North Korea. They wanted something in return. Traoré could sense the tension in the room. The North Korean envoy, a thin man with sharp features and a calm demeanor, presented the terms with chilling precision. "President Traoré, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea seeks not only to support Burkina Faso but to establish a long-lasting partnership. We will provide your country with military technology, expertise, and economic resources. In exchange, we require your loyalty and support in international forums." The offer was tempting, but Traoré knew it came at a cost. He was not a man who easily trusted anyone, least of all someone from a regime known for its brutality and unpredictability. "Your proposal is intriguing," Traoré said slowly, his voice measured. "But I need time to consider the implications. This is not just about Burkina Faso. It's about the future of Africa." The envoy smiled, but there was a coldness to it. "We understand, Mr. President. But time is of the essence. The West has already made their intentions clear. They are planning to isolate you to destabilize your government. The meeting ended with no clear resolution, but the pressure was mounting. Traoré returned to his office, his mind racing. The stakes had never been higher. The West would never accept him turning toward North Korea, but could he afford to ignore the power and resources that Kim Jong Un offered? That night, as he lay in bed, Traoré's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, vivid dream. He was standing in the heart of Ouagadougou, surrounded by thousands of his people. Their faces were filled with hope, their eyes shining with expectation. But in the distance he saw something that sent a chill down his spine, a massive shadowy figure looming over the crowd, threatening to crush them all. The dream was unsettling, but Traoré understood its message. It was a warning from his ancestors, a reminder that the decisions he made now would shape not only his future but the future of his people. The weight of history hung heavy on his shoulders, and he knew that he could not afford to fail. The next day Traoré called a meeting with his inner circle. His trusted generals, advisors and political allies gathered in the war room, the atmosphere thick with tension. "We are at a crossroads," Traoré began, his voice steady but resolute. "The letter from North Korea is not just an opportunity. It's a challenge and it comes with risks. But we must decide if we will stand firm in the face of the West's pressures or if we will ally with Kim Jong Un to secure our future." His generals exchanged glances, and the silence in the room was palpable. After a long pause, General Cohn, a grizzled veteran of the military, spoke up. "Mr. President, the West has failed us. They have ignored us, exploited us and undermined our sovereignty for far too long. North Korea may be a rogue state, but they are not our enemies. They know what it's like to stand alone against the world, and they may be the only ones who understand our struggle." Traoré nodded slowly, weighing the words carefully. He knew that General Cohn's support was crucial. But there was another voice that had been growing louder in his mind, a voice that reminded him of the promises he had made to his people. "I appreciate your counsel, General," Traoré said. "But we must not lose sight of who we are. Burkina Faso's strength lies in its people, in our independence. I will not sacrifice that for anything." His advisor Omar, ever the pragmatist, added, "Mr. President, the people look to you for leadership. They will follow you, but only if they believe you are acting in their best interests. The world is changing and we must decide where we stand." As the conversation continued, the decision before President Traoré grew ever more complicated. North Korea's offer was undeniably powerful, but the cost of accepting it could be more than he was willing to pay. As the meeting drew to a close, Traoré felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. His advisors and generals left the room, each man lost in his own thoughts, but the president remained standing by the window, gazing out at the horizon. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows over the city, and for a moment, Ibrahim Traoré allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He was a man caught between two worlds, one of Western pressure filled with the promise of foreign investment, aid and security, and another, darker world, where the offer from North Korea held a dangerous allure, with power and influence but at the risk of further isolating Burkina Faso from the international community. As the day faded, a thought kept circling in his mind. He had made promises to his people. He had vowed to protect their dignity and sovereignty. And yet, he found himself at a crossroads, where the choices were stark, and the consequences were far-reaching. That night, Traoré sat alone in his office, the silence pressing in around him. He reached for the letter from Kim Jong Un once more, reading through it again, feeling the cold, impersonal language as if it were an ultimatum. "I will not be a puppet," he muttered under his breath. Even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. The West, in its pursuit of control, had already shown its true face in recent years, imposing sanctions, undermining Africa's autonomy, and creating conditions that destabilized nations for their own gain. They had forgotten the blood of Africa's struggle, the weight of history and the power of its people. Would aligning with North Korea truly be the answer? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. President, it's time for the meeting with the UN representatives," Omar said. Traoré stood, smoothing his jacket. He knew the meeting was a formality, another attempt by the West to pressure him. But he had to go through with it. This was the world he was now a part of, and he could not afford to show weakness. As he entered the UN conference room, he was met with a sea of faces, diplomats, representatives from various nations, and the familiar, scrutinizing gaze of the West. The tension was palpable. Traoré took his seat at the head of the table, his posture straight, his mind focused, but inside, a storm raged. The UN envoy, a seasoned diplomat from France, spoke first. "Mr. President, We are here today to discuss your country's relationship with the West and the international community. We are concerned by recent developments, including reports of your interest in an alliance with North Korea. The tone was condescending and Traoré could feel the pressure mounting. He held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. I understand your concerns, Traoré said, his voice calm but firm. But let me be clear. Burkina Faso is a sovereign nation. We will make our own decisions. And we will not be dictated to by any foreign power. The silence in the room was deafening. The diplomats exchanged nervous glances, but Traoré could see the disdain in their eyes. They weren't used to hearing such defiance, not from a leader of a small African nation. We urge you to reconsider, Mr. President, the French diplomat said. Aligning with North Korea would isolate Burkina Faso, endanger your people's future, and make you a pariah in the eyes of the world. Traoré stood, his gaze unwavering. You do not control us. You will not dictate our choices. Burkina Faso has suffered under foreign domination for far too long. We will make decisions based on what is best for our people, not based on your whims or threats. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the diplomats speechless. Outside, his advisor Omar was waiting for him. Mr. President, that was bold, Omar said, his voice a mixture of admiration and concern. I will not bend, Traoré replied. The people of Burkina Faso deserve better. They deserve to be free. As the days passed, the pressure mounted from all sides. The West's condemnation of his stance grew louder, and the whispers of an internal coup became more frequent. There were those within his own government who saw this as an opportunity to remove him, to restore order by submitting to the West's demands. But Ibrahim Traoré stood firm. He would not let his country fall into the hands of those who had never cared for its people, never understood its struggles. He would fight for Burkina Faso's dignity no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and the political tension within Burkina Faso reached a boiling point. Ibrahim Traoré's stance had created a ripple effect, not only within his country but across the region. The Western powers, in their usual manner, had intensified sanctions, cutting off crucial financial aid and trade routes. Meanwhile, whispers of a coup within his own government grew louder with each passing day. Traoré had always known that power was a fragile thing, easily gained, easily lost, but now the reality of that fragile power was sinking in. His choices were becoming fewer. In the quiet of the presidential palace, Traoré sat at his desk, his fingers tracing the edge of Kim Jong Un's letter once more. The cold, blunt words stared back at him. North Korea had promised more than just military support and diplomatic backing. They had offered something that seemed impossible. A chance for Burkina Faso to rise from the ashes of colonialism, a chance to stand strong and unyielding, not as a pawn but as a force in its own right. The question remained, was the price of that strength worth the consequences? Traoré's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Omar stepped inside, his face drawn with concern. Mr. President, Omar began, there's news from the military. We've received reports of increased movements from the opposition forces in the north. They are rallying and there are whispers of foreign support. Traoré's gaze hardened. Who is backing them? We don't have confirmation yet, but there are signs of Western involvement, possibly covert operations. They may be testing our resolve, preparing to strike. The president stood, his back straight, his mind calculating the next steps. So, they believe that we will crumble under pressure. They underestimate us. But we will not yield. Omar hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Mr. President, there are also talks within the government. Some factions are growing impatient. They believe we've made a grave mistake by refusing to align with the West. They want you to step down to make peace with the West before it's too late. Traoré's jaw clenched. I will not bow down to foreign pressure. I will not betray my people for temporary security. We've endured centuries of oppression, and we will not submit again. Let them come. Omar nodded, though the weight of the situation was clearly taking its toll on him. What do we do now? Traoré walked over to the window, looking out at the bustling streets of Ouagadougou. He could hear the distant sounds of life, people moving about, going about their daily routines. His country was full of promise, full of strength. The people deserved to live with dignity. They deserved a future that was not dictated by foreign interests. Now, Traoré said, turning back to Omar, we prepare. We fortify our alliances and stand our ground. We will not let the West dictate our future, and we will not let anyone destroy the progress we've made. Later that night, as the city slept, the president convened a private meeting with his closest allies, military leaders, intelligence officials, and members of his inner circle. The plan was set into motion. The first step was to secure the borders, ensuring that no external forces could intervene in the growing unrest. The second step was to solidify their position within the region, reaching out to neighboring countries who shared their desire for independence from foreign influence. Finally, the third step was the most dangerous, dealing with the internal threat. The opposition, now well organized, was a serious challenge, but Traoré knew he could not afford to wait any longer. As the hours stretched on, the president felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The world was watching and his every move would be scrutinized. But this was his moment, Burkina Faso's moment. And he would not allow history to repeat itself, where Africa's sovereignty was traded for temporary peace. At dawn, the plan was set into motion. Military units were deployed to key locations, and the government issued a public address, warning the opposition forces that any attempt to undermine the nation's sovereignty would be met with swift resistance. The battle was far from over, but Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a man in a suit trying to navigate political pressure. He was a leader standing on the precipice of history, prepared to defend his country, its legacy and its future, no matter what it cost. The storm was coming. And in the heart of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré made his final choice. It would not be the West that would dictate the fate of Burkina Faso. As the sun rose over Ouagadougou, the first signs of a heavy day ahead were already visible. The air was thick with tension, the kind of energy that comes just before the storm. Ibrahim Traoré stood on the balcony of his presidential palace, his eyes scanning the horizon. This was the moment of truth. He had chosen the path of resistance, and now he would see if his people were ready to follow. The opposition forces had been quiet for the past few days, but Traoré knew they were regrouping. Their efforts had been bolstered by covert foreign intervention, and now they were emboldened, ready to strike. His own forces were spread thin, stretched between the borders and the cities, trying to keep the peace while also preparing for war. But Traoré was resolute. He knew the price of freedom. He had seen it in the eyes of his people. He would not let them down. Inside the palace, the war room buzzed with activity. Military commanders and intelligence officers moved about in a flurry, discussing logistics and tactical strategies. Umar, standing by the window, watched as the city's life unfolded beneath them. A bustling marketplace, children running through the streets, the distant hum of traffic. The world had no idea that a storm was brewing. Umar turned to Traoré, who was deep in thought. "Mr. President," he began, his voice low, "there are whispers that the coup is not just a military threat. There are rumors of internal betrayal within your own ranks." Traoré's gaze shifted. "Who?" "Several senior officials, some in your own party. They're negotiating with foreign powers, trying to weaken your position. They want to see you fall." A cold smile curled on Ibrahim's lips. "Cowards. They have no loyalty to the people. Only to their own power." Umar nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "The people are behind you, Mr. President. But the question remains, how long can we hold out against both external and internal threats?" "We will hold as long as it takes," Traoré replied, his voice steady but laced with the weight of his resolve. "But we need to act before the opposition makes its move." That night, as the shadows grew long, the first signs of the opposition's advance became clear. The streets of Ouagadougou, usually filled with the hum of daily life, grew eerily quiet. A sense of anticipation hung in the air. And then the first shots rang out. The city erupted into chaos as armed men, dressed in military fatigues, stormed key government buildings. In the distance, the unmistakable sound of gunfire echoed through the streets. Traoré's forces were ready, but the battle was far from over. Inside the war room, the tension was palpable. "The coup is underway," one of the commanders reported. "We've already lost control of the northern districts. They have the support of some key military factions. We will not let them take this city," Traoré said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We will retake what is ours." The battle for Ouagadougou was fierce and unrelenting. Traoré's soldiers fought with the kind of passion that only comes when a people are fighting for their freedom. The opposition, bolstered by foreign-backed mercenaries, was well-armed and well-trained, but they had underestimated the resolve of the Burkinabe people. Each street became a battleground, each building a fortress. Traoré moved with purpose, coordinating his forces from the presidential palace, his mind sharp despite the chaos unfolding around him. Umar was by his side, issuing orders, coordinating logistics, and making sure that reinforcements were being sent to the front lines. The world was watching, but Ibrahim Traoré refused to back down. As the night stretched on, the fighting intensified. But just as Traoré's forces began to gain ground, another unexpected twist occurred. The skies above Ouagadougou suddenly lit up with the sound of low-flying aircraft, a fleet of planes heading straight for the city. It wasn't a normal military strike. This was something different, something far more dangerous. "They're using air support," Omer said, his voice tight with concern. "This is more than just a coup. The foreign powers are directly involved." Traoré gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. "It doesn't matter. We will fight." Minutes later, the city was plunged into darkness as the first wave of bombs struck, sending shockwaves through the streets. Buildings crumbled, dust filled the air, and the sound of explosions reverberated in the distance. But amidst the chaos, Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, his eyes blazing with defiance. "This is our land," he said quietly. "We will not let them take it." The battle waged on into the early hours of the morning. As the sun began to rise once more over Ouagadougou, the city was in ruins, but Ibrahim Traoré was still standing. He had seen the worst of the storm, and though the battle was far from over, his spirit remained unbroken. By the time dawn broke, the city of Ouagadougou looked like a battlefield straight out of history, a land torn apart by violence and unrest. Yet, amidst the smoke, rubble, and ruin, the spirit of resistance was still alive. Ibrahim Traoré stood tall as the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the chaos surrounding him. His face, covered in dust and sweat, betrayed no sign of fear. If anything, it showed the calm of a leader who had embraced the storm and was now prepared to weather it. In the aftermath of the bombardment, the streets were littered with the remnants of buildings, vehicles, and bodies. The devastation was heartbreaking, yet in this very destruction, the seeds of resistance were taking root. Traoré's forces, though battered, had regrouped and formed defensive lines in strategic locations across the city. The people, many of whom had spent the night hiding in the shadows, now began to rise, picking up arms and joining the fight. Omer, his trusted aide, hurried to Traoré's side as the president surveyed the damage. "Sir, our forces have managed to hold the western districts. But the enemy is fortified on the east. We need to reinforce our position before they get the upper hand." Ibrahim nodded without hesitation. "We will push them back. This is not just a battle for Ouagadougou. This is a battle for the soul of our country. We cannot let these foreign powers take control. They don't understand us, Omer. They don't understand our people." Omer's eyes narrowed as he looked at the advancing opposition forces. "But the airstrikes, the mercenaries, they're not backing down. What's our next move?" Ibrahim turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "We take back what's ours, Omer. We fight them in every street, in every alley. We'll use what we have. The people are with us. And our ancestors, their spirits are with us too." The words hung in the air, a silent promise of resistance that would not be broken. Ibrahim's resolve was like steel now, tempered by the fires of war. The land had suffered for too long, and he knew that no matter the cost, this would be their stand. As the battle continued to rage, Traoré's forces began to regain lost ground. The mercenaries sent by foreign powers, well-equipped though they were, began to falter in the face of the relentless spirit of the Burkinabe. The fighting was fierce, and the streets became rivers of blood, but the will to survive, the will to protect their homeland, was stronger than any foreign force could imagine. Yet even as the tide began to shift in their favor, Ibrahim knew they weren't out of danger. The foreign powers, those who had backed the coup from the shadows, were still a major threat. And there was something else lingering, something he couldn't quite place, an internal betrayal that had been brewing long before this conflict had ever escalated. The whispers of disloyalty within his own government were becoming louder, and Ibrahim knew the time for dealing with it was fast approaching. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a secret meeting was convened in the bowels of the presidential palace. Only a handful of trusted allies were present: Omer, a few military leaders, and some key intelligence officers. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with uncertainty. "Ibrahim," Omer said, breaking the silence, "I've been hearing disturbing things. There are high-ranking officials within your administration, people you trust, who are talking to the enemy. I don't want to believe it, but the signs are there. We need to root out the traitors before they do any more damage." Ibrahim's gaze was steely as he listened to Omer's words. His suspicions had been growing, but hearing them aloud confirmed his worst fears. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "I knew this day would come. I've seen the signs. It's not just the foreign mercenaries we're fighting now, Omer. It's the ones within our own ranks. We cannot afford to let them tear us apart from the inside. We need to act quickly." Omer nodded. "Who do you suspect?" Ibrahim's eyes narrowed. There are a few names I've been hearing. But right now we cannot afford any more leaks. We'll have to deal with this quietly without causing panic. The conversation moved to tactics, to strategy. But in the back of Ibrahim's mind, there was another layer of strategy playing out. He had to ensure the loyalty of his people, not just his soldiers but the very heart of the country. And the first step in that was to find the traitors among them. The next day, a covert operation was launched. Special forces, trusted men and women, infiltrated key locations, high-ranking government offices, military bases and intelligence hubs. One by one they identified the traitors. Some were arrested quietly, while others disappeared into the night, their fates sealed. As the traitors were weeded out, Ibrahim's forces grew stronger. The opposition, thinking they had broken the spirit of the people, began to underestimate the resolve of the Burkinabe. And just as they thought victory was within their grasp, Traoré launched a counteroffensive that would change the course of the conflict. The streets of Ouagadougou once again became a battleground, but this time it was different. This time the enemy found themselves fighting not just against soldiers, but against a united nation. The resistance had grown, not only in arms but in spirit. And as the skies cleared of smoke, a new force emerged. One that would not bend, one that would not break. The final act of this conflict was about to unfold. Would the foreign powers be able to maintain their grip on the country, or would Ibrahim Traoré's resolve carry the day? The world waited with bated breath, knowing that the outcome of this battle would echo far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. As the battle for Ouagadougou raged on, the heart of the resistance continued to beat strong. Ibrahim Traoré had become a symbol of hope, not just for his people, but for the oppressed across the African continent. His leadership, marked by a combination of calculated military strategy and unyielding moral conviction, had transformed what was once a hopeless struggle into a war of liberation. Yet as the war intensified, so did the stakes. In the heart of the presidential palace, Ibrahim sat alone, the weight of leadership heavy upon him. The flickering light of a single candle cast shadows on his face, his brow furrowed in deep thought. A map of the city was spread across the table before him, every street marked with the locations of both friendly and enemy forces. The room was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the candle's flame. Omer entered quietly, his footsteps soft on the marble floor. He had grown accustomed to seeing his leader in moments of solitude, but today was different. Ibrahim's face, usually stoic and strong, now seemed tired, his eyes betraying the fatigue that had taken root after days of ceaseless battle. "Sir," Omer began, his voice low, "the eastern flank is holding but the enemy is regrouping. We need reinforcements and we need them now." Ibrahim looked up, his gaze steady, yet full of an unspoken heaviness. "Reinforcements? There's more to this war than just bullets and men. It's a battle for our very identity, Omer. And in the end it's not just the enemy we must defeat, but the forces that want to erase us, to erase our history, our future." Omer nodded solemnly. "You're right. The world is watching us, Ibrahim. Every move we make echoes beyond our borders." Ibrahim's voice grew more intense. "And the world will see that we will not bow. We will not surrender. Our people deserve better. We deserve better. The West wants us to be their puppets, but we will not dance for them." The tension in the room was palpable. Ibrahim Traoré was not simply fighting a foreign power, he was fighting for the soul of his nation. His every decision, each strategy, each action, was calculated not just to win the war, but to reshape the future of Burkina Faso. Outside the palace, the streets of Ouagadougou were a scene of chaos. The fighting had reached a fever pitch. The smoke from burning vehicles mixed with the dust from the dry roads, creating a haze that seemed to hang over the city like a shroud. The sound of gunfire was relentless, punctuated only by the roar of military vehicles moving swiftly through the streets. The people, the everyday men and women of Burkina Faso, had become warriors in their own right. They had not waited for permission from the government or the military. They had taken up arms in defense of their homes, their families, their heritage. And now they were united with the soldiers, fighting not just for survival but for the dignity of their nation. In the midst of the street battles, a young woman named Amina emerged. She had been part of the city's underground resistance for months, but now she had become a leader in her own right. Armed with nothing but her courage and a rifle she had stolen from the enemy, Amina led a small group of fighters into the heart of the conflict. Her eyes were filled with the fire of a nation that had been beaten down for too long but refused to break. "Move forward," Amina shouted to her group, her voice fierce. "We fight for our children. We fight for our future. This is our home." Her words were more than just a rallying cry, they were the heart of the resistance, a reminder of what they were fighting for. And as her group advanced, they became part of the larger tide that was pushing back against the foreign invaders. Back in the palace, Ibrahim's meeting with his inner circle had concluded, and he made his way to the war room, where military strategists and advisors were already working tirelessly to keep pace with the changing front lines. He stood silently for a moment, observing the frantic activity around him. The air was thick with urgency, but there was also a sense of hope, a quiet understanding that, despite the odds, victory was within reach. Ibrahim's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message. He glanced at it and his expression hardened. It was a message from Kim Jong Un. Ibrahim, the message read, "I understand your resolve. You have shown strength. But strength alone will not save you. The West may have more firepower, but we have something they do not, loyalty. And we stand by you. We will assist, but we will also expect something in return. Do not forget who your true allies are. The world is watching and you are not alone." Ibrahim's grip tightened around the phone. The North Koreans had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike their own deal. The alliance was tenuous, but it was an alliance nonetheless. Ibrahim's mind raced as he pondered the implications of this new development. If they were truly going to win this war, he would have to navigate these new alliances carefully. But even as he considered his next move, he knew one thing. He could not afford to lose sight of what this fight was truly about. The people of Burkina Faso had been oppressed for far too long. And now they were standing at the precipice of change. Ibrahim would not let them fall back into the darkness. The war had reached its most critical moment. Forces from both sides were preparing for a final showdown, one that would decide the future of Burkina Faso, and perhaps all of Africa. The battle for Ouagadougou was coming to its climax, and the world held its breath, waiting to see who would emerge victorious. Would it be the forces of foreign domination, or would Ibrahim Traoré and his people rise up, reclaiming their country and their destiny? The answer was yet to be written. But one thing was certain, the fight was far from over. The days blurred together as the final days of the battle approached. The streets of Ouagadougou were soaked with the weariness of a long conflict. Yet, in the heart of the people, something had shifted. The desire for freedom, for dignity, was no longer a distant hope. It had become a consuming fire that burned brighter with each passing moment. Ibrahim's mind was constantly moving, his every decision weighed with the knowledge that one wrong move could unravel everything they had fought for. His strategies, once rooted in military tactics, were now deeply intertwined with the emotions of his people. He understood that this war was not just about weapons or soldiers, it was about a collective consciousness, a nation that was waking up to the strength within itself. In the capital, news spread like wildfire that the final assault was imminent. The foreign-backed forces had amassed on the outskirts of the city, preparing for what they believed would be the decisive strike. But the resistance was ready. It was in the late hours of the evening when Ibrahim stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, overlooking the city he had vowed to protect. The wind was cool against his skin, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the distant fires. The lights of the city flickered below, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. The war had taken its toll, but it had also forged a new unity among the people. "Sir," a voice called out from behind him. It was Omar, his most trusted advisor. "The final battle begins at dawn. Are you ready?" Ibrahim's gaze never wavered from the city. He felt the weight of his people's hopes resting on his shoulders, but he knew he couldn't let fear cloud his judgment now. "We have no choice, Omar. Tomorrow we will either rise or fall. But I refuse to let this land fall into the hands of those who have no respect for its people." Omar nodded, his face set in determination. "We've fought too long, Ibrahim. This is our moment." As the night stretched on, the tension in Ouagadougou was palpable. Fighters from all corners of the city gathered in underground bunkers and hidden safehouses, preparing for the final push. Their resolve was unshakable. This was not just a battle for survival, it was a battle for their legacy, their identity, and their freedom. Among them was Amina, the young woman who had become a symbol of resistance. She stood at the front lines, her eyes alight with fierce determination. The rifle in her hands had become an extension of her will. She was no longer just a fighter, she was the embodiment of the collective strength of her people. As dawn broke, the first light of day casting a blood-red hue over the battlefield, the fighters took their positions. The final assault had begun. The enemy forces, confident in their superiority, advanced on Ouagadougou with the intent of crushing the resistance in one swift blow. They did not anticipate the fierce counteroffensive that awaited them. The people of Burkina Faso were no longer fighting just for survival, they were fighting to reclaim their future. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, the clash of metal against metal ringing out as the two forces collided. The resistance fought with a fury that was born of desperation and hope, their every action a testament to their resilience. Ibrahim's forces, bolstered by the loyalty of the people, pushed forward with unwavering strength. In the heart of the battle, Ibrahim stood at the head of his men, his face grim but resolute. His voice cut through the chaos, directing his forces with precision. "Advance! Push them back!" he shouted, his words carried on the wind. And advance they did. The foreign-backed forces, unprepared for the sheer determination of the resistance, began to falter. Their lines broke, and for the first time in the war they found themselves on the defensive. As the battle raged on, a new element entered the fray, an unexpected alliance. North Korean soldiers, following the agreement Ibrahim had made with Kim Jong Un, began to move into the battlefield, their presence adding a new layer of complexity to the fight. While their numbers were few, their military expertise and ruthless tactics turned the tide in favor of the resistance. Ibrahim watched from his vantage point as the battle unfolded before him. His heart raced with the intensity of the moment. Victory was within their grasp, but it came at a cost. The loss of life was inevitable, and the scars of this war would last long after the last shot was fired. But Ibrahim Traoré had always understood that true freedom came at a price. Hours later, as the sun began to set, the final remnants of the enemy forces retreated. The streets of Ouagadougou were littered with the aftermath of battle: broken vehicles, discarded weapons, and the bodies of those who had fought and died. The resistance had won. But the cost had been high. Ibrahim stood once more on the balcony of the presidential palace, looking out over the city that had been his battleground. The winds had shifted, carrying the promise of a new dawn. His people had won their freedom, but the journey was far from over. The world would not forget the sacrifices that had been made here today, and neither would Ibrahim. As he turned to walk back inside, his phone buzzed once more. It was a message from Kim Jong Un. "Victory is yours, Ibrahim. But remember, loyalty is a two-way street. Do not let your new alliances blind you. The West may not forgive you, but you have shown them what it means to stand firm." Ibrahim read the message and placed the phone down on the table. He knew that the world would be watching closely now, but he also knew that his people had proven something far more important than just their ability to fight. They had proven their resilience, their unity, and their unyielding determination. As he looked out at the city once more, he whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The resistance forces had emerged victorious, but the challenges were far from over. Ibrahim Traoré found himself juggling not only the task of rebuilding the country but also navigating the complex geopolitical landscape that had shifted dramatically in the aftermath of the battle. The Western powers, who had once looked down on Burkina Faso as a minor player on the world stage, were now paying close attention. They had underestimated Ibrahim's resolve, and they were not pleased by the outcome of the war. Diplomatic channels were opening, and whispers of sanctions and political pressure began to circulate. Ibrahim knew that the price of freedom was not just blood on the battlefield, it was also the constant vigilance required to maintain power in a world that was always ready to take it away. In the weeks that followed, Ibrahim met with foreign dignitaries, including ambassadors from Russia, China, and even North Korea. Each conversation was a delicate dance, an attempt to secure Burkina Faso's sovereignty while managing the delicate relationships between these powerful nations. The letter from Kim Jong Un, which had initially seemed like a lifeline, now felt like a constant weight on Ibrahim's shoulders. The North Korean alliance had provided the tactical advantage they needed to win the war, but Ibrahim couldn't ignore the underlying tension. The West would never forgive him for aligning with such a controversial regime, and that could spell disaster for his people if he wasn't careful. But Ibrahim was no fool. He understood that the world had no interest in African nations asserting their autonomy, especially when it came at the expense of Western interests. One night, as Ibrahim sat alone in his office, contemplating the complex web of alliances and threats, a knock came at the door. It was Umar, his trusted advisor, who entered the room with a serious expression. "You're still up?" Umar asked, concern etched on his face. "I couldn't sleep," Ibrahim replied, motioning for Umar to sit. "There's too much at stake right now. I've won the war, but I can't let my people fall into the same trap as before. I have to be strategic about every step." Umar nodded, sitting down across from him. "The world will try to force your hand, Ibrahim. They'll attempt to isolate you, to weaken you. You have to be ready for that. I know, Ibrahim said quietly. But this isn't just about politics. This is about a people who have suffered for too long. This is about them, not just me. I can't let the sacrifices of the past be in vain. There was a long silence before Umar spoke again. You've done what many thought was impossible. You've freed your people from oppression. But now the real test begins. Your people will need you more than ever, and the world will be watching. Ibrahim met Umar's gaze, his resolve hardening. And I will not let them down. The next morning, Ibrahim was once again on the move. He had arranged meetings with both local leaders and international representatives. It was a balancing act. A game of diplomacy where every word could either strengthen his position or lead to disaster. First on the agenda was a meeting with the leaders of the African Union. Ibrahim had always believed in Pan-African unity, and this was his chance to solidify Burkina Faso's position within the broader African context. He needed to ensure that his victory didn't become an isolated incident. He needed the support of the African continent. As Ibrahim walked into the conference room, he was greeted by representatives from various African nations. The room was tense, but there was an underlying respect in the air. Ibrahim had proven himself on the battlefield, and now he needed to prove that his leadership could guide Burkina Faso, and Africa, toward a new era. I stand before you not as a victor, but as a servant of the people, Ibrahim began, his voice steady and unwavering. Burkina Faso's victory is not just ours. It is a victory for every African nation that has ever been oppressed. It is proof that we too can chart our own course. But we need each other. We cannot succeed alone. The room was silent, every leader listening intently. Ibrahim continued, his words echoing with the weight of history. We must build an Africa that is not dependent on foreign powers, an Africa that stands on its own 2 feet, united in its diversity and strong in its independence. If we allow ourselves to be divided, we will fall. But if we stand together, there is nothing we cannot achieve. The leaders of the African Union listened closely, their faces unreadable. Ibrahim's words were powerful, but words alone would not be enough to secure the continent's support. It would take time, effort, and sacrifice. Ibrahim knew that. But he was willing to do whatever it took. Later that day, Ibrahim met with representatives from the United States and the European Union. These were the conversations that weighed most heavily on his shoulders. He had already seen the shifting dynamics of international relations. The West was uneasy about his alliance with North Korea. The West would never accept Burkina Faso's defiance, but Ibrahim had no intention of backing down. The meeting was tense. The diplomats from the United States and the European Union were cordial but firm. They demanded that Burkina Faso distance itself from North Korea and cease its alliance with the regime that had been widely condemned for its human rights abuses. Ibrahim remained calm, his voice unwavering. Burkina Faso is a sovereign nation, he said, and we will make decisions based on what is best for our people, not based on the whims of foreign powers. The diplomats exchanged looks, their discomfort palpable. But Ibrahim was resolute. You may not like our choices, but we will not be intimidated into submission. We have our dignity and we will not compromise it. The meeting ended with no resolution, but Ibrahim had made his stance clear. He would not bend to Western pressure. That evening, as Ibrahim sat alone in his office, the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. He had fought for this moment, for this victory, and now the real work was beginning. He looked out the window, his thoughts turning to the future. The road ahead would be difficult, but Ibrahim was no stranger to adversity. He had led his people to victory, and he would lead them through the next phase of their journey, no matter the cost. The world was watching. And Ibrahim Traoré was ready. As the weeks passed, the political climate grew even more strained. The diplomatic pressure from the West was relentless, and the looming shadow of a potential coup continued to haunt Ibrahim's every decision. His enemies, both foreign and domestic, were not willing to let the momentum of his rise go unchallenged. The fractures within the government were becoming more pronounced, and Ibrahim knew that some of his closest allies might be plotting against him. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing classified reports, his most trusted military commander, General Saran, entered the room. She was a seasoned leader with a sharp mind and a loyal heart, but there was something in her eyes that made Ibrahim pause. "Saran, what's wrong?" Ibrahim asked, gesturing for her to sit. General Saran hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There are whispers, Ibrahim. Whispers of betrayal within our own ranks. Some of your closest advisors are no longer loyal. They're seeking to align themselves with those who oppose you." Ibrahim leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. He had anticipated that the forces of dissent would try to infiltrate his inner circle, but hearing it confirmed made the threat feel real, immediate. "You're certain of this?" Ibrahim asked, his voice low. Saran nodded gravely. "I've had my sources confirm it. There's talk of a coup being orchestrated, and it's coming from within the government itself. We can't afford to wait much longer before we act." Ibrahim stood up, his fists clenched. "We've come too far to let this slip away. We can't allow them to turn the progress of our people into dust. I will not be betrayed." Saran placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "Then we will fight together. We will root out those who would bring you down, and we will ensure that no one can break the will of the people." The next days were a blur of intense meetings, covert operations, and secret gatherings. Ibrahim trusted very few people, but the ones he did had earned his unwavering loyalty. He began to tighten his grip on the reins of power, carefully positioning his most loyal supporters in strategic positions within the government. He knew that a coup was inevitable if left unchecked, but he also understood that he had a unique opportunity to strike first. The game of politics was one of calculated risks, and he was more than prepared to take the risks that others would shy away from. That night, Ibrahim sat down with Saran to discuss the next steps. They laid out a plan to root out the conspirators and make sure that any threat to his rule would be swiftly and decisively handled. Every move would need to be executed with precision. One misstep could mean the end of everything. "We need to act fast," Ibrahim said, scanning the map of the capital laid out before them. "The moment we show weakness, we risk everything." Saran nodded. "We'll need to mobilize the forces quietly. We can't afford a public spectacle, but we also can't afford to let them get comfortable in their positions. They need to believe that they have nowhere to run." Ibrahim's eyes hardened. "And when they make their move, we'll be ready." As the days went by, the tension in the capital reached a boiling point. Ibrahim's advisors, both loyal and treacherous, grew more and more divided. The whispers of betrayal turned into open confrontations, and it became clear that the inevitable clash was on the horizon. One evening, just as Ibrahim was preparing for another round of high-stakes negotiations, a coded message arrived. It was from one of his most trusted operatives, deep inside the opposition camp. The message was brief, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "They move tonight." Ibrahim's heart raced as he read the message. The moment had come. The conspirators had made their move, and now Ibrahim had to act swiftly, decisively, and without hesitation. He called for Saran and his most trusted commanders to assemble immediately. There was no time to waste. The resistance had already been mobilized on the streets, and Ibrahim's government forces were preparing for the inevitable showdown. "I have the element of surprise," Ibrahim said, his voice sharp with determination. "We strike first. No mercy for those who dare to betray the people." Saran nodded, her expression resolute. "We will not fail you, Ibrahim. We fight for the future of Burkina Faso." That night, as the streets of the capital hummed with the uneasy tension of a city on the brink of conflict, Ibrahim's forces moved in silently. The conspirators were caught off guard by the precision and swiftness of the government's response. The operatives in the opposition camp had underestimated Ibrahim's resolve, thinking they could seize power without consequence. It was a swift, calculated operation. Ibrahim's men stormed key government buildings, apprehended the leaders of the coup, and quelled the uprising before it could fully take root. There were no riots, no explosions in the streets, just the sudden, overwhelming power of a government that had already anticipated the threat. By morning the coup was over. The leaders of the insurrection were in custody, and the remaining conspirators were scattered, their ambitions crushed before they could take flight. Ibrahim Traoré had emerged victorious once again, but this victory came at a cost. The battle for control had exposed just how fragile the political landscape truly was. The resistance may have been defeated, but the war for his people's future was far from over. The days that followed were filled with both triumph and introspection. Ibrahim's position had been solidified for now, but the question lingered in the back of his mind. Could he maintain it? Could he continue to steer Burkina Faso through the treacherous waters of international politics and internal strife? The answer, Ibrahim knew, was simple. He had no choice. The stakes were too high, the hopes of his people too great. He would fight for Burkina Faso's future, and he would protect its sovereignty with every ounce of his strength. As he looked out over the capital from his office window, Ibrahim made a silent vow. He would not let the forces of corruption and betrayal destroy what had been built. He would stand firm as a symbol of hope, defiance, and the unbreakable will of his people. The world may have underestimated him before, but they would never make that mistake again. As the dust settled and the political landscape began to stabilize, Ibrahim's focus shifted back to the pressing matter of his international relations, particularly with North Korea. The offer from Kim Jong Un had never been far from his mind, and he knew that in order to secure Burkina Faso's future, he would need to tread carefully on the global stage. The West had already shown its displeasure, but what if his next move could further isolate him from their influence while opening the door to a new alliance? Could the North Korean offer be more than just a lifeline? It could be the key to shaping a future where Burkina Faso was not just a pawn in the geopolitical game, but a powerful player in its own right? That morning, a second letter arrived from Kim Jong Un, more formal and direct than the last. It was accompanied by a small group of North Korean diplomats, who arrived quietly in the capital under the guise of a diplomatic mission. Ibrahim stood on the steps of the presidential palace, flanked by his military commanders and security forces, as the diplomats were escorted to a private meeting room. "I want a full report on their agenda," Ibrahim instructed Saran, his mind racing with possibilities. "We need to know what they want and how much we can afford to give." Saran nodded and stepped away, while Ibrahim waited for the diplomats to arrive. As he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this very choice, could either cement his place in history or mark the beginning of his downfall. The North Korean diplomats arrived in neat black suits, their expressions solemn as they were ushered into the palace. Kim Jong Un had made it clear that he expected no delays in his proposal, but Ibrahim knew that such matters required patience. The stakes were too high for any hasty decisions. In the meeting room, Ibrahim sat across from the head diplomat, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes. The diplomat introduced himself as General Pak, a senior member of Kim Jong Un's inner circle. His handshake was firm, but there was a coolness to his demeanor that made Ibrahim wary. "We bring a message from our leader, Kim Jong Un," General Pak began, his voice low but steady. "Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads, and we believe an alliance between our two nations can ensure your survival in these troubling times. In return for your cooperation, we offer technical support, military aid, and, most importantly, security against the Western powers that have sought to destabilize your government." Ibrahim listened intently, weighing the words. The offer was tempting, but it also carried a heavy price. Aligning with North Korea would mean further alienating the West, particularly the United States and the European Union. The economic repercussions would be significant, and it was unlikely that Burkina Faso would find new trade partners without Western influence. At the same time, the possibility of military support from a country as powerful as North Korea was undeniable. But what would such an alliance truly entail? Ibrahim had learned the hard way that power was rarely given without strings attached. "What are your expectations in return?" Ibrahim asked, keeping his voice neutral. General Pak's gaze remained steady, his expression unwavering. "We seek your commitment to our cause. In exchange for our aid, we ask that you support North Korea in international forums, particularly in the United Nations. Additionally, we request access to resources, primarily minerals and natural resources, in exchange for technology and infrastructure assistance. We also expect cooperation on defense matters." The offer was clear: support for resources. Strategic alliances that could give both North Korea and Burkina Faso leverage on the global stage. Ibrahim leaned forward, considering the possibilities. "And if I decline?" General Pak's expression did not shift, but his words were laced with subtle threat. "You will be left alone, President Traoré. The West will continue its pressure and your enemies will gain strength. You will have no other allies to rely on. Your government will be weakened." The diplomat's words hung heavy in the air. Ibrahim's heart raced as he processed the gravity of the decision before him. Could he afford to stand against the West? Was it worth risking Burkina Faso's future for the promise of power that could come with such a dangerous alliance? Saran re-entered the room just as Ibrahim was deep in thought. She had a grim expression on her face. "Sir, there are reports of increased Western interference in our communications. The United States has already dispatched a delegation to our borders under the guise of humanitarian aid. There are murmurs of sanctions. The pressure is mounting." Ibrahim stood, his decision crystallizing in his mind. The West would not back down, but he had already seen their methods, their economic pressure, their covert tactics. They would not hesitate to exploit any weakness. If North Korea could offer something that would shield his country, even if only for a time, he would need to take that chance. "I accept your offer, General Pak," Ibrahim said, his voice steady. "But know this, I will not be a pawn in your game. Our alliance will be one of mutual respect and benefit. I will not sacrifice Burkina Faso's sovereignty for any foreign power. General Pak smiled, the first sign of warmth Ibrahim had seen from him. Of course, President Traoré. Mutual respect is the foundation of any great partnership. The deal was sealed. As the North Korean diplomats left the palace, Ibrahim couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision settle in. He had chosen a path that could lead to both prosperity and peril. The political landscape of Africa and the world was changing, and he was at the heart of that change. Would he be able to navigate the dangerous waters ahead? Would this alliance truly bring the security and strength that Burkina Faso needed, or would it eventually drag him into a conflict that would consume everything he had worked to build? Ibrahim knew that only time would reveal the consequences of his choice. But one thing was certain, he would never back down. No matter the price, he would fight to protect Burkina Faso from those who sought to control its destiny. The days following Ibrahim Traoré's decision were marked by a whirlwind of diplomatic activity. News of the alliance with North Korea spread quickly, igniting reactions from all corners of the globe. The West responded swiftly with condemnation, but their words were laced with frustration. They had underestimated Ibrahim's resolve. They had expected him to crumble under the pressure, but instead he had made a bold move, aligning himself with one of the most secretive and formidable regimes in the world. In Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was tense but cautiously hopeful. The president had made it clear that the alliance was not without strings, but it was also not a sign of submission. He had sold it as a strategic move to safeguard the nation's sovereignty, and the people were beginning to see the potential benefits. In rural villages, there were whispers of the new roads and infrastructure that would come with the deal. The promise of military support also offered some comfort to those who feared the growing instability in the region. However, there were also those who questioned the wisdom of Ibrahim's decision. In private circles, members of the political elite murmured about the risks of isolating Burkina Faso from the West. The possibility of sanctions weighed heavily on their minds, and many feared that the nation's economy would buckle under the strain. The president had made his decision, but the consequences were still unknown. Ibrahim spent his days meeting with military commanders, diplomats, and advisors, working tirelessly to ensure that the transition into this new era would be as smooth as possible. He understood that the stakes were high, and that failure was not an option. But even as he worked, he couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the back of his mind. Was he truly in control of this situation, or had he unknowingly placed Burkina Faso in a dangerous game of geopolitics that could spiral out of control? His thoughts were interrupted one morning when Saran entered his office with a report. Her face was grim. "Mr. President, the West has already begun its retaliation," she said, handing him a dossier filled with detailed reports. "Sanctions have been imposed on several key industries, including mining and agriculture. There are also reports of covert operations being conducted along our borders. We are not yet sure of the extent, but it's clear that they are trying to destabilize us." Ibrahim's jaw tightened as he read through the reports. The pressure had begun. The West had wasted no time in responding to his defiance. But Ibrahim had anticipated this. He had known that the moment he accepted North Korea's offer, he would be branded a pariah. The question now was how to navigate this new reality. He looked up at Saran. "What's our next move?" "We need to stabilize the economy as quickly as possible," Saran replied. "We can't afford to lose the mining sector or agricultural exports. We should start negotiating with regional partners to open new trade routes and find alternative markets for our goods." "And the military?" Ibrahim asked. "We've already begun strengthening our defenses," Saran said. "We've received some initial shipments of weapons and equipment from North Korea, but it will take time to integrate their support into our forces. We'll also need to be prepared for any direct intervention from the West." Ibrahim nodded, his mind already turning to the next steps. He couldn't allow Burkina Faso to be caught in a prolonged conflict. He had to be strategic, every move would need to be calculated. As he left his office later that day, Ibrahim walked through the palace grounds, deep in thought. The weight of leadership pressed down on him, but he refused to let doubt take root. This was his moment and he would not let it slip away. That evening he gathered his closest advisors for a meeting in the palace's war room. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with anticipation. Around the table sat some of his most trusted figures: military commanders, intelligence officers, and key political allies. "I need you all to understand something," Ibrahim began, his voice steady. "This is not just a political maneuver. This is about our survival. The West has already shown us their hand. They will stop at nothing to see us fail. But we cannot afford to back down. We must remain strong and we must outsmart them at every turn. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. We will need to be prepared for everything, he continued. We will use every tool at our disposal: diplomacy, military strategy, and even unconventional tactics. This will be a battle not just for our country's survival, but for our place in the world. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation hung in the air. A young officer, Commander Adama, spoke up. Sir, with all due respect, we cannot fight both the West and North Korea at the same time. We need a clear strategy. What is the end goal here? Ibrahim turned to face him, his eyes unwavering. Our goal is simple: to maintain our sovereignty. We are not aligning ourselves with North Korea for the sake of a long-term partnership. We are using their support as leverage to secure our independence. The West will understand that they cannot bully us into submission. If they want to play hardball, we'll show them that we're willing to fight for our future. Commander Adama nodded, understanding the resolve behind Ibrahim's words. And how do we deal with the economic pressure? We'll find new markets for our resources, Ibrahim replied. We'll strengthen our ties with regional powers, and we'll build a coalition of African nations that can stand with us. We won't let them isolate us. The meeting continued late into the night, as plans were drawn up and contingencies discussed. Ibrahim knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that he was not alone in this fight. His countrymen were resilient, and they had a shared vision of a prosperous future, one that didn't rely on the whims of foreign powers. As he walked back to his quarters later that night, Ibrahim couldn't help but think of the path that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a young officer, dreaming of a better Burkina Faso, and now he found himself at the center of a global storm. But he would not back down. He would fight for his people, for their freedom, and for their future. The days that followed were a test of endurance and willpower for President Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso's economy continued to struggle under the weight of Western sanctions, but Ibrahim remained focused. His resolve had hardened like iron, and he refused to let his people feel the full brunt of the external pressures. He could feel the tension in the air as the country teetered on the brink of a precipice. But Ibrahim had always been a man of action, and he wasn't about to let his people down. In the months that followed, his diplomatic efforts bore fruit. The African Union, along with several key regional powers, began to stand by Burkina Faso. Leaders across the continent, many of whom had once viewed him with skepticism, began to see the wisdom in his approach. They too had suffered under the yoke of Western exploitation and saw Ibrahim's defiance as a symbol of hope. The winds of change were sweeping across Africa, and Burkina Faso was at the forefront of it. Ibrahim's strongest allies came from the east, Russia and China, both eager to counterbalance Western influence on the continent. While these nations were still hesitant to openly endorse the alliance with North Korea, their support was unequivocal in terms of trade and military aid. China began to invest heavily in infrastructure, while Russia supplied arms and technology that helped modernize Burkina Faso's defense systems. As Burkina Faso began to stabilize its internal economy, Ibrahim turned his attention to the military. He was fully aware that a nation could not afford to be vulnerable, especially one under as much scrutiny as his. With North Korea's help, the country's military started to receive specialized training and high-tech weaponry. While the West had imposed sanctions, they had underestimated the capabilities of North Korean support, highly advanced weaponry, intelligence, and training that could potentially shift the balance of power. The Burkinabe military, once limited by resource constraints, now had access to modern equipment, and Ibrahim's forces grew stronger. Tensions along the borders simmered, but the presence of a capable military force made foreign intervention far less likely. The West might have been watching, but it was now clear they could no longer bully Ibrahim into submission. The balance of power had shifted in his favor. But as much as Ibrahim fought against external pressures, there were also those within his country who were watching his every move. The threat of a coup was never far from his mind. Even as he strengthened his alliances and bolstered the country's defenses, there were whispers in the dark corners of political circles, whispers that threatened to undermine his entire regime. One evening, Ibrahim was meeting with his most trusted advisors when Saran, his chief of staff, brought troubling news. "Mr. President," she began, her voice grave, "we've intercepted communications. There are factions within the military that are plotting against you. They believe that your alliance with North Korea is reckless and could lead to the downfall of the nation. They are mobilizing quietly, securing weapons and alliances of their own." Ibrahim's jaw clenched. The threat of a coup had always been his greatest fear. He had known that there would be enemies both outside and within his government. But now it was becoming a reality. "How deep is it?" he asked, his voice cold with determination. "We're still tracing the source of the conspiracy, but it's clear that they have supporters among the upper ranks of the military," Saran replied. "If we don't act fast, we could lose control." Ibrahim paused for a moment, weighing the gravity of the situation. He had risen to power not by chance but by sheer force of will. He had navigated through treacherous waters before, and he would do so again. "We'll strike first," he said finally, his voice resolute. "We will neutralize them before they have a chance to act. Make the necessary arrangements and ensure our loyal officers are ready. We cannot afford to hesitate." Saran nodded and left the room to execute his orders. In the days that followed, Ibrahim orchestrated a delicate campaign to root out the conspirators within the military. His forces conducted discreet raids on suspected traitors, and loyalists within the military began to close in on those plotting against him. By the time the would-be coup plotters realized they had been exposed, it was too late. Several key officers were arrested, and the remaining factions were disbanded before they could cause any significant damage. But the danger wasn't over. Ibrahim knew that there were still pockets of resistance within the country. Those who were opposed to his methods and those who had their own ambitions for power. And while the coup had been thwarted, the political instability it left in its wake was undeniable. Ibrahim stood before the nation once more, addressing the people with a mix of defiance and humility. He knew that in times like these, the strength of a leader was tested not only by his ability to hold power but by his ability to lead through crisis. "My people," he began, his voice echoing through the halls of the National Palace. "We have faced tremendous challenges both from abroad and from within. But we stand strong. The threats we face are not just political, they are existential. They are a challenge to our sovereignty, to our dignity as a nation." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We will not be cowed. We will not bend to foreign powers or to traitors within our ranks. Burkina Faso is a sovereign nation, and we will chart our own course. We will rise not as puppets of the West, but as a proud, independent nation, strong, united, and free." The crowd erupted in applause. The words were powerful, but it was his unwavering conviction that truly stirred them. Ibrahim had become a symbol of resistance, not just to the West but to all who sought to undermine his vision. But even as the people cheered, Ibrahim knew that the storm was far from over. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges and he would have to remain vigilant. His alliance with North Korea had brought him strength, but it also painted a target on his back. He would have to navigate the intricacies of international diplomacy and power struggles, all while maintaining control of his fractured country. The international landscape was becoming increasingly volatile. Ibrahim Traoré's bold alliances with Russia, China, and North Korea had undoubtedly strengthened his position, but they also made him a marked man in the eyes of the Western world. The threats that had initially come in the form of sanctions and diplomatic pressure were now escalating. The West had begun to tighten the noose, using economic leverage, media campaigns, and covert actions to destabilize his regime. The American government, particularly, had become a major thorn in his side. Under pressure from influential military-industrial complex figures, the United States had deployed covert operatives in neighboring countries, making it clear that any support of Ibrahim's regime would not go unpunished. Ibrahim's phone had been tapped multiple times, and he had even received subtle, veiled threats through back channels. But these efforts only served to harden his resolve. "Mr. President," said Saran one day, entering his office with a new intelligence report, "we've intercepted communications. The U.S. is putting pressure on our neighbors, urging them to limit trade with us. It's becoming a chess game, and they're trying to isolate us from the African continent." Ibrahim was unfazed. He had always known that his path would not be easy. His resolve was solidified by the deep connection he had to his people, the generations before him who had fought against colonization, the heroes who had shed their blood for the dignity and freedom of the African continent. He was no different from them. He too would fight, not only for his own survival but for the survival of an entire continent's sovereignty. "I will not allow Burkina Faso to be reduced to a pawn in their game," Ibrahim said with a firm tone. "Reach out to our allies. We have no choice but to deepen our ties with Russia and China. If the West wants to play this game, we'll show them what happens when they underestimate Africa's strength." But even as Ibrahim plotted his diplomatic counterattacks, he knew that this war of influence was not just about alliances, it was about perception. The world's opinion was shifting, and Burkina Faso's position within the African Union was becoming more precarious. Some countries had begun to question the wisdom of Ibrahim's bold moves. There were whispers that his alliance with North Korea could backfire, possibly leading to further international isolation. As the days passed, the political atmosphere grew more tense. Ibrahim found himself in a delicate balancing act. He had to maintain the appearance of a leader who was in control, of his country, of his military, of his alliances, but also one who could convince the international community that Burkina Faso was not a rogue state. His leadership was under constant scrutiny, and the pressure was mounting. One night, Ibrahim was alone in his office reflecting on the road ahead. The weight of the nation was on his shoulders. He had chosen the path of defiance, but it was a path filled with uncertainty. The outcome of this high-stakes game was still far from clear. Could he continue to fend off the pressures from the West while maintaining his country's sovereignty? Could he survive the coup attempts, the internal strife, and the looming threat of foreign intervention? The answer, he realized, lay not just in military might or international alliances. It lay in the unity of his people, the resilience of a nation that had faced adversity time and time again and had always risen from the ashes. Burkina Faso was not just a country, it was a symbol of Africa's struggle for dignity and freedom. And Ibrahim was its guardian. As dawn broke over the city, Ibrahim received an unexpected call. It was from Kim Jong Un. "Ibrahim," the voice on the other end said, "we've been monitoring the situation. You are not alone in this. North Korea stands by you." Ibrahim felt a sense of relief wash over him. The support from North Korea, while controversial, was invaluable. He knew that he could not stand against the world's most powerful forces alone. This was not just about Burkina Faso, it was about sending a message to the world that Africa was no longer willing to bow to external pressures. "I appreciate your support," Ibrahim responded. "But we must be careful. The world is watching and our every move is under scrutiny. We must move forward with caution but with strength." Kim Jong Un's voice grew firmer. "You are correct. But remember this, history will not forget those who dare to stand against oppression. Africa has long been the subject of exploitation. Now is the time for its leaders to take their rightful place on the world stage." Ibrahim nodded. The truth of Kim Jong Un's words rang in his ears. Africa had been subjected to centuries of exploitation, and it was time for the continent to stand tall. It would not be an easy road, but it was a road that Ibrahim was ready to walk. As he hung up the phone, Ibrahim looked out over the city, the rising sun casting a golden light on the streets below. His country was at a crossroads, and he was leading it into uncharted waters. The path would be fraught with danger, but it was also a path that could lead to freedom, dignity, and a new era for Africa. He made a vow to himself as the winds of change blew across the land. He would not be swayed. He would not yield. He would fight with everything he had, not just for Burkina Faso but for the future of Africa. And with that vow, Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that his country's fate, and the fate of a continent, rested on his shoulders. As the days turned into weeks, Ibrahim Traoré's resolve only grew stronger. The weight of his decisions, the looming threats from the West, and the delicate balance of international relations never left his mind. But as he stood at the helm of Burkina Faso, he felt a deep sense of purpose. He knew that his actions, his alliances, and his unwavering stance against external domination were not just about protecting his country, they were about redefining Africa's place in the world. The road ahead would not be without peril. The pressures of economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert operations were ever present, and there were still those within his own ranks who doubted his vision. But Ibrahim's belief in the unity and strength of his people, coupled with the support from his international allies, gave him the fortitude to carry on. Each day he met with his advisors, soldiers, and diplomats, carefully crafting strategies to navigate the treacherous waters of global politics. But behind every decision, every move he made, was the knowledge that he was shaping the future of his nation and, by extension, Africa. The winds of change were blowing and Africa's time to rise was now. Ibrahim understood that the path to true freedom and dignity would be long and fraught with challenges. The scars of colonization, the exploitation of Africa's resources, and the subjugation of its people could not be erased overnight. But he had set something in motion, a movement, a vision, a promise, that could never be undone. As the years passed, Ibrahim Traoré's legacy would be remembered not just as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as a symbol of Africa's resilience and strength in the face of overwhelming adversity. His actions, his courage, and his commitment to his people would inspire generations to come. He had proven that no matter the size of the opponent, no matter the obstacles in the way, Africa's leaders could rise above the tides of history and carve out their own destiny. The world had been watching, and now the world would never forget the name of Ibrahim Traoré.